When you watch a building collapse on the news, your eyes naturally go to the dust cloud.
Right, the drama of it all.
Exactly. The sheer drama of the falling roof just commands all your attention. But structural engineers, well, they operate completely differently.
They ignore the roof entirely.
Yeah, they do. They look straight at the foundation to figure out the exact physical mechanics of, why the cornerstone failed in the first place. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a literal geopolitical earthquake right now.
A massive one.
It really is. The year is 2026, and Iran is standing at this absolutely historic crossroads. We are living in the immediate aftermath of the June 2025 12-day war.
Which was unprecedented on its own.
Totally. And now we're navigating these crazy internet shutdowns and witnessing mass civilian uprisings. What the sources in our stack today are actually calling a national revolution.
Right, and it's a movement fundamentally challenging the clerical establishment from the ground up.
And on top of all this, the 86-year-old supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is reportedly ailing. So the foundation isn't just cracking here, it's practically pulverized.
Yeah, we're examining a state where the unwritten social contract has just completely decayed. The transitional window is wide open right now.
Which is terrifying and fascinating.
It is, and the systemic volatility is so profound because, the entire architecture of the state was built around one man's ultimate authority.
So to understand how a collapsed building gets reconstructed, we've gathered a massive stack of sources for you today. We're looking at excerpts from university sociology departments, foreign relations reports, deep legal analyses of the Iranian constitution.
We even have actual transitional blueprints drafted by the Iranian opposition.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to explore one very specific, vital focus, and that is the independent judiciary, the cornerstone of democratic governance in Iran's post-2026 transition.
It's a linchpin to everything.
It really is. And I want to be clear to you listening, while our context today is specifically about Iran, this is ultimately a masterclass in how societies build or destroy the rule of law. It's a cautionary tale about the invisible wiring of power that applies literally everywhere. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Rebuilding the judiciary is the absolute cornerstone of Iran's future. But to grasp why, we first have to perform an autopsy on the current system.
Right, how it was designed to fail.
Exactly. We have to look at the structural anatomy of the 1979 Constitution, specifically as it was amended in 1989, because it was explicitly engineered to prevent justice.
That's a strong statement.
But it's true. It creates this vertical hierarchy where all legal authority funnels upward to a single apex. So Article 57, it nominally separates the executive, legislative, and judicial branches.
Like most modern constitutions, right?
On paper, sure. But then it mandates that all of them operate under the absolute rule of the supreme leader.
Which just negates the whole separation part. Reading through these legal analyses, the structure of the Guardian Council is just the perfect example of that engineered failure.
Oh, the mechanics of it are wild.
It really is like a rigged game, or, a snake eating its own tail. Look at how it rigs the referee. The supreme leader unilaterally appoints the head of the judiciary, right?
Right.
And then that appointed head nominates 6 lawyers to sit on the 12-member Guardian Council.
While the supreme leader directly appoints the other 6 clerics.
Exactly. And this single 12-man council has absolute veto power over any law passed by the parliament. Plus, they proactively vet, meaning they can just preemptively disqualify any political candidate. So how can anyone expect a fair trial when the referee is entirely owned by one team? The judiciary is completely captured before a single gavel is even banged.
What's fascinating here is how the system utilizes the illusion of a legal framework to legitimize ideological repression. The head of the judiciary cannot just be an experienced judge or administrator.
No, the Constitution has strict rules on that.
Right. It mandates they must be a just mujtahid, which is a high-level expert in Islamic jurisprudence. So the apex of the judicial branch is always a senior cleric.
Which changes the whole purpose of the courts.
Totally. This institutional design ensures the judiciary never functions as a neutral arbiter of the law. It basically operates as a subordinate bureaucracy designed purely to implement the sovereign's theological will across the population.
And the ground reality of that theological will, it is documented extensively in our stack today. The sources lay out rampant forced confessions and these codified, deeply discriminatory laws specifically targeting women and minorities.
Like the Baha'is and Sunni Muslims.
Yes, exactly. And then you have the mechanism of the revolutionary courts.
Which is a whole other layer of repression. They were established initially in 1979 as these temporary bodies to try officials of the deposed monarchy.
But they never went away.
No, they became a permanent fixture, and they are utilized specifically for prosecuting these vague charges like national security crimes or corruption on Earth.
Which could mean almost anything.
Exactly. And they operate entirely outside conventional procedural codes. It allows the state to bypass standard evidence requirements and basic legal defense rights.
The specifics in our reading are just staggering. Like, there is this detailed account regarding Revolutionary Court Judge Abogassim Salavati.
Oh, the 15-minute trials.
Yes. The sources document instances where he handed down death sentences for alleged security or drug charges after trials that lasted a total of 15 minutes. I mean, 15 minutes is barely enough time to read a charge sheet aloud, let alone actually examine evidence or mount a defense.
It's not a trial. It is a bureaucratic rubber stamp for an execution.
It really is.
And the regime weaponizes that legal ambiguity by justifying asset seizures, the revocation of citizenship, and criminalizing peaceful dissent through just the outermost edges of constitutional interpretation. The judiciary basically morphs into the antithesis of the rule of law.
It's just a tool for survival.
Right. It serves as the primary instrument of state survival.
So if this entire state apparatus is completely dependent on the supreme leader, his departure, especially given his age and his declining health since those 2025 strikes, it creates a terrifyingly large power vacuum.
The physical keys to the state are suddenly just up for grabs.
Which brings us to the future. The foreign relations reports in our stack map out 3 distinct trajectories for this 2026 crisis. So what happens next?
Well, scenario 1 is managed continuity. This represents the regime's institutional backup plan.
Plan B.
Exactly. The Assembly of Experts, which is the clerical body ostensibly responsible for selecting the supreme leader, they would elevate a trusted loyalist from the inner circle.
Who are the sources pointing to?
They frequently point to Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, or the current Chief Justice, Gholam Hossein Mohseni Ej. The operational goal here is basically to maintain Khameneism without Khamenei.
So nothing changes for the courts.
Right. The judiciary would experience zero structural reform. It would just continue its role in ideological enforcement.
Okay, the second trajectory is a military takeover. And the mechanics of how this could happen are really fascinating. I mean, IRGC has a massive operational bench.
They control huge chunks of the economy.
Yeah, vast sectors from telecommunications to heavy infrastructure.
Yeah.
So they don't necessarily need to roll tanks down the street in a traditional military coup. By simply controlling the internet, the ports, and internal communications, they could just freeze the clerics out of the operational running of the state.
Without firing a single shot.
Exactly. And if they drop the pretense of religious legitimacy for absolute military rule, the clerical courts we just analyzed could be immediately sidelined.
We would likely see civil courts replaced entirely by outright military tribunals, which would eradicate any remaining facade of civil liberties.
That's a dark scenario.
Very. But the third trajectory, however, is where the bulk of our transitional blueprints focus, and that is regime collapse and democratic transition.
This is the national revolution scenario.
Right. It envisions the current uprising actually succeeding, creating a bottom-up collapse that necessitates a provisional government and the drafting of an entirely new secular constitution.
And various diaspora groups are intensely mobilizing around this third scenario. Now, I want to be super clear here. We are looking at these proposed frameworks strictly as architectural blueprints.
We're analyzing the nuts and bolts.
Right, the mechanics of their proposals. We are maintaining strict impartiality here, so we aren't endorsing any of the political figures behind them. But for instance, Mariam Rajavi of the NCRI, she has articulated a 10-point plan calling for a non-nuclear secular republic with the total separation of religion and state.
And concurrently, you have exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi proposing a 100-day transition blueprint.
Right.
His framework heavily emphasizes a national referendum, arguing that the ultimate form of government, whether that's a republic or a restored constitutional monarchy, it must be decided organically by the Iranian people, not just imposed by transitional councils.
So different visions, obviously.
Very different. But both of those frameworks, despite originating from vastly different political ideologies, they converge on the absolute necessity of a highly structured transitional period.
Meaning a temporary governing body to manage the state apparatus until free, internationally monitored elections can actually be executed.
Exactly.
But, here's where it gets really interesting. I am kind of stuck on a historical inevitability here. I mean, If the regime actually collapses, aren't we just staring at a catastrophic power vacuum?
It's the biggest risk.
Right. When you look at the history of revolutions in the region, how do they avoid simply swapping a theocratic dictator for a military or populist one? The public might overthrow the clerics, but another strong man usually just walks right into the empty palace.
It's a valid fear. But you prevent a new dictatorship by building an impenetrable structural firewall. According to the legal scholars and the transitional experts in our sources, avoiding that historical trap relies entirely on how the new transitional government designs the mechanisms of an independent judiciary.
It's the only institutional check on a new executive.
Absolutely. It's the cornerstone.
The blueprints call it building a new House of Justice.
I love that term. And the theoretical foundations for this architecture, they are actually internationally standardized. The blueprints pull heavily from the UN Basic Principles on the Independence of the Judiciary and the Bangalore Principles of Judicial Conduct.
So they aren't reinventing the wheel.
No, not at all. The foundational shift in thinking here is that judicial independence isn't a professional privilege granted to judges. It is a fundamental human right of the citizens to be tried by an impartial tribunal.
That makes total sense. And the legal analyses break this down into external independence and internal independence. External independence is fairly intuitive, right? It means protecting the courts from politicians, the executive branch, or the military.
Keeping the outside pressures away.
Exactly. But the concept of internal independence is a fascinating mechanism. It means protecting a junior judge from the intimidation of a senior judge.
That's a huge issue in corrupt systems.
It really is. Imagine like a young, newly appointed secular judge in some rural province who wants to acquit a political protester. If the senior judge in their district can simply pick up the phone, threaten the junior judge's pension, or just have them transferred to some remote outpost.
You don't have a fair court?
No, you have a judicial mafia.
Exactly. And achieving both internal and external independence requires transitional democracies to employ what they call a fourth branch institution.
The sources suggest creating a standalone judicial council, which is wild because I initially assumed a new democratic parliament would just, take over managing the courts. But these blueprints argue for removing the politicians entirely.
You have to keep them completely separate.
Right. So this council becomes a completely separate fourth branch of government that independently handles the hiring, firing, discipline, and promotion of every judge in the country.
You take the administrative keys away from the Ministry of Justice.
Yes. Meaning the executive branch has absolutely no leverage over who sits on the bench.
But, structural isolation is incredibly vulnerable if it isn't backed by financial autonomy.
Oh, follow me.
Always. The legal sources highlight this stark reality. If the executive branch or the parliament can simply starve the courts of funding in retaliation for an unfavorable ruling, the judiciary is entirely captured.
So how do you fix that?
A post-transition constitution must mathematically guarantee the judiciary a fixed percentage of the national budget. For example, a hard 2%. And that cannot be altered or reduced without virtually impossible legislative supermajorities.
The mechanics of how they secure that money are brilliant. It isn't just about giving the judiciary a guaranteed trust fund so they don't have to constantly ask their overbearing parents, the executive branch, for an allowance.
Right. They don't just ask nicely.
No. The blueprints suggest granting the courts mandamus power. So if the Ministry of Finance tries to illegally freeze the court's budget, mandamus power means the judiciary has the actual legal authority to order the central bank to bypass the government entirely and hand over the funds.
And if they don't,
they can threaten to arrest the bank executives for contempt. The courts literally have the legal authority to forcefully seize their own paychecks.
It's ultimate financial fireproofing. But securing the personnel and the finances still leaves the massive mechanism of constitutional review. Because how does the new state ensure the new constitution is actually obeyed by lawmakers?
That's the million-dollar question.
The sources deeply contrast two primary models here. First, the American model, which is decentralized, meaning any court at any local, state, or federal level can decide questions of constitutionality.
And if you're listening to this on your commute or at your desk and wondering why constitutional models matter when people are literally protesting in the streets, it's because this is the invisible wiring that determines if those protests remain legal next year.
It's vital. And the experts in our stack strongly argue that the decentralized American model would be disastrous for a post-theocratic Iran.
Why is that?
Well, the decentralized model relies on a long tradition of legal homogeneity. In a post-2026 Iran, utilizing that model means a low-level seminary-trained judge in a deeply conservative rural province could just unilaterally strike down progressive secular laws passed by the new parliament.
By citing their local interpretation of Sharia or old constitutional remnants.
Exactly. It creates a chaotic, fragmented legal landscape. So instead, the blueprints point to the European or Kelsen model.
Which centralizes the power.
Yes. It creates a single, specialized constitutional court. By adopting the Kelsen model, the new state creates an unassailable legal oracle. Only this specific, highly vetted court has the jurisdiction to interpret the Constitution or strike down legislation.
It prevents rural ideological holdouts from sabotaging national secularization.
Precisely. The Constitutional Court acts as a high-prestige anchor, aggressively protecting the new democratic order from theocratic revivalism. It keeps constitutional interpretation strictly out of the hands of lower courts.
Okay, so we've mathematically guaranteed their funding, we've structurally isolated the courts with a fourth branch, and we've centralized constitutional review. But none of that matters if the human beings wearing the robes are the exact same ones who operated the old system.
The human element is the hardest part.
It is. How do you replace an entire nation's judiciary without collapsing the legal system overnight? This brings us to the lustration debate. And I have to admit, I am really struggling with the proposed solutions in these blueprints.
Lustration, which is the process of purging officials associated with the abuses of a prior regime, it is consistently the most volatile phase of any democratic transition.
I am stuck on why this is even a debate, though. I mean, we just discussed judges handing out 15-minute death sentences. Why are the transitional blueprints talking about giving these individuals due process? If you want to build a new society, shouldn't a new provisional government immediately fire every single judge associated with the old regime?
Purge them all.
Yes, purge them completely. Otherwise, aren't you just letting regime loyalists sabotage the new government from the inside?
The impulse for wholesale lustration is entirely understandable. I get it. But historically, blanket purges are catastrophic.
Really?
Think about it. If you fire thousands of sitting judges overnight, the entire civil administration collapses. Crime spikes exponentially. Business disputes stall. Property rights just dissolve.
Okay, that makes sense practically.
But more dangerously, broad ideological purges mimic the exact authoritarian tactics of the deposed regime. The new government immediately faces accusations of enacting victor's justice. By stripping a massive faction of the population of their livelihoods without cause, you generate a highly educated, deeply aggrieved class of people.
Who have every incentive to start an insurgency against the new state.
Exactly.
But if you keep them on the bench, public trust remains at absolute zero. I mean, how can a protester who was tortured in 2025 walk into a courtroom in 2027 and trust a system staffed by the exact same people who signed their arrest warrant?
That is the ultimate dilemma. And the mechanism to resolve this, as detailed in the transitional literature, is a meticulously designed, victim-centered vetting process.
Based purely on individual accountability.
Yes. You do not fire someone simply for being a judge under the old regime. You fire and prosecute them only if there is specific documented evidence of human rights abuses, corruption, or involvement in sham political trials.
Which requires an incredibly complex investigative apparatus.
It does. It's not easy. Furthermore, the blueprints stress that the judges being vetted must be afforded rigorous due process. They must have the right to review the evidence against them and the right to appeal.
Wow.
By granting due process to the architects of an oppressive system, the transitional government forcefully demonstrates that the era of arbitrary state power is officially over.
That's a powerful psychological shift.
And simultaneously, the state must completely overhaul the educational pipeline. You cannot rebuild a judiciary if your judges are still coming from theological seminaries.
Right, you need new blood.
The transition requires heavily investing in modern, secular law schools that emphasize international human rights, creating a whole new generation of legal professionals to slowly dilute the old guard.
And the Foreign Relations reports provide specific global examples of where these exact mechanisms succeeded and where they tragically failed. I thought this part was fascinating.
Me too. Eastern Europe in the 1990s is cited as the primary success story.
Right. Countries like Poland and Czechia managed to successfully reform their judiciaries and navigate lustration because they had a powerful external anchor.
They desperately wanted to integrate into the European Union and the Council of Europe.
Exactly. That provided intense, sustained international pressure and technical guidance to ensure their judicial reforms met strict democratic metrics.
But the geopolitical reality for a post-2026 Iran is that it lacks a comparable, robust regional anchor like the EU to guide its transition, which makes the structural design even more critical.
They are kind of on their own.
They are, and the sources heavily cite Tunisia as a chilling warning of what happens when it goes wrong.
What happened there?
Following the 2011 Arab Spring, Tunisia did everything the international community advised. They drafted a highly progressive constitution in 2014, and they successfully established an independent Supreme Judicial Council to structurally isolate the courts.
So they did the fourth branch thing.
On paper, the architecture was flawless.
But the mechanism failed.
Right. It failed the public. The new Judicial Council failed to clear massive logistical bottlenecks in the courts. Everyday citizens waited years for basic civil disputes to be resolved, and the judiciary was just incredibly slow in adjudicating high-profile corruption cases involving the old regime.
So people got frustrated.
That administrative incompetence actively eroded public trust. If we connect this to the bigger picture, when the public no longer believes the judiciary serves their interests, the institution loses its invisible shield. In 2021, Tunisian President Kais Saied capitalized on that widespread public frustration. He launched an executive power grab, unilaterally dissolved the Supreme Judicial Council by decree, dismissed dozens of judges, and essentially subjugated the courts back under total executive control.
And let me guess, the public didn't try to stop him.
There was no massive public uprising to defend the judges because the public had lost faith in them.
So what does this all mean? It means drafting a brilliant constitution and isolating the funding just isn't enough. The institutions themselves are incredibly fragile if the public doesn't fiercely believe in their utility.
Tunisia proves that structural reform must be inextricably linked to a profound cultural shift. The judges themselves must fiercely protect their independence, and the public they serve must visibly value it.
Because if the populace does not actively defend the courts, a charismatic populace will simply dismantle the structures and revert the system back to authoritarianism.
In a heartbeat.
Well, let's distill the sheer scale of the journey we've been on today. We started by dissecting a 2026 regime that has masterfully weaponized the law.
A system where the supreme leader holds absolute vertical authority over the courts.
Right, and where justice is measured in 15-minute execution rubber stamps. Then we explored the massive power vacuum that is coming and how a military takeover by the IRGC could simply change the uniforms of the oppressors.
Without changing the underlying system.
Exactly. And most importantly, we've seen that Iran's post-2026 survival hinges entirely on building a financially autonomous, structurally isolated house of justice. It requires a judicial council to hire independently.
Mandamus power to seize their own funding.
Yes, and a centralized constitutional court to prevent ideological sabotage.
The ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, transcends the borders of Iran. This deep dive is a reminder that democracy is not simply the act of going to a ballot box every few years.
Voting is just the superficial surface of freedom.
Exactly. True democracy lives in the mundane, highly bureaucratic, and fiercely protected structural independence of the courts. It is the boring reality of a judge knowing with absolute certainty that they cannot be fired, defunded, or intimidated for ruling against the government.
That invisible wiring
Yeah.
is what actually keeps a society free.
It really is the foundation, not the roof.
I love that. Well, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought from our sources to mull over as you go about your day. The transitional texts warn that the totalitarian mindset often survives the collapse of totalitarian regimes.
It's a terrifying psychological reality.
It really is. So if you were handed the blueprint and tasked with rebuilding a nation's justice system overnight, how would you ensure that the people rightfully demanding justice don't accidentally utilize the exact same poisoned tools of oppression they just bled to overthrow? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.